There is no error with your audio outputs. Do not attempt to fix any sound issues. We are monitoring you with this device. We control your options and settings. We are transmitting through your internet connection, but our signal is actually entering your mind, sending electrical impulses into the very tissues of your brain. Try to stay calm. We've taken over your senses for the duration of this broadcast. You are helpless to resist. We have taken control for your own sake. There are things you must know. This is Paranoia Radio, hosted by Olaf Phillips and Ron Patton.
Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of the Paranoia Podcast. I am Olaf Phillips. I'm the publisher of Paranoia Magazine. On the line, I have Ron Patton. Ron is our editor-in-chief. Ron?
Hey, thanks for having me aboard, Olaf Phillips.
Well, certainly, Ron Patton. So this is our first episode, so we thought that we'd kind of run through what we hope to achieve by doing this podcast. It's a little boring, but at least you guys will get an idea. And then we had a kind of topic we were going to cover. So the way we normally want to approach this podcast is that we want to talk about a subject and really kind of get into it and kind of educate people as to the true nature of these conspiracies. Because what both Ron and I have found over time is that a lot of people are very interested in conspiracies of all kinds, but they don't know the details, or there's an important kind of a foundational conspiracy, like the John F. Kennedy thing, where they don't know much about it. So Ron and I thought it would be interesting and fun to do a podcast for Paranoia and to kind of get into some of those conspiracies and discuss them, and because many times Ron and I have differing opinions, but we can kind of get into it, and then, you, the listener out there, will kind of have a better idea of that conspiracy. So I guess we'll cut to the chase. This is a no bullshit kind of operation.
Wow, you can swear too, huh?
You can. It's not terrestrial radio, Ron, so there's no FCC.
Oh, wow. We should put this on pirate radio.
We should put this on pirate radio. If I had a pirate radio station, I would.
Yeah, but then you'd have to change your name and, your location and all that stuff.
And speaking of locations, I am broadcasting from the Conspiracy Cabana, and Ron is broadcasting from the Paranoia Bunker, buried deep within under Portland there.
At least 60 feet.
At least 60 feet. Yeah, you'll survive a lot at 60 feet.
Well,
Sure.
There's a lot of underground tunnels here in Portland, that were actually made about, I guess, over 100 years ago. So there's a lot of conspiracies around the Portland, sort of the underground tunnels of Portland. I guess they used them for kidnapping women and taking them to China. So,
well, they used to kidnap people and quote unquote Shanghai them and force them to work on ships too.
Yeah.
In San Francisco, supposedly we have a bunch of tunnels that are buried deep under the city that have maybe 7-foot long rats, and supposedly the triads use them for running drugs and other stuff. But it's supposedly the whole thing has a catacomb of tunnels underneath it.
Yeah, that'd be interesting if you could actually investigate some of those tunnel systems. You have those type of tunnels, and then you have the government kind of tunnels. There was a book actually written back in the early 90s by Dr. Richard Sauter, and it had to do with how the government was building all these underground bunkers and tunnels and
nuclear powered bore machines too.
Yeah, crazy stuff. But earlier you were talking about conspiracies and sort of the dynamics of conspiracies, and I just wanted to touch upon that. I think it's really important that people understand the foundation of a conspiracy And so basically what we're trying to do is kind of set the framework, or, putting together a frame of reference for people to understand what a conspiracy is. And, basically the definition of a conspiracy in a nutshell is it's a secret plan by a group, 2 or more people, to do something harmful or unlawful. And I've always been telling people for years that, conspiracy permeates every part of society. So that can include families, that can include religion. We definitely know it happens in politics and in business.
For sure.
So it's something that we really can't get away from, yet it's sort of this nebulous, mystical term that I think most people think of when they hear the word conspiracy. Wouldn't you agree?
Totally. And one of the things that I found is that as somebody who's interested in conspiracies, when I go to the bookstore, because I'm a human being, surprisingly, when I go to the bookstore and I look for conspiracy books, a lot of times conspiracy books are actually kind of bunched in with the with metaphysical and New Age books.
Yeah.
And that's actually not true. It should more be in the politics arena
Mm-hmm.
or in history, because a conspiracy as an entity exists in history, it exists in politics, it exists in crime, it exists in all facets of life. But it should also be pointed out that one of the other important things about conspiracies is that the way we find out about them. Now, a lot of times we find out about them because a whistleblower, they're called whistleblowers,
Right.
a whistleblower will come out and say, hey, I know about this conspiracy, I'd like to share the fun. And the reason that is because because people inherently have trouble keeping secrets. Now, we have a security state, and we have many security states, in fact, where people are given security clearances and told secret things that are not supposed to be revealed.
Mm-hmm.
And, I do, as an individual, I do believe that some secrets are meant to be kept,
Right.
Around national defense and things like that. But sometimes these people become angry. They didn't get the raise they wanted. They didn't get the job they wanted. They're having a bad time at home or whatever. And they decide to share the fun with everybody else and cut loose and, like Edward Snowden, tell everybody, or the Panama Papers, tell everybody what's going on. And I once had a very wise man tell me that that normally to have a conspiracy, it takes 2 or more people, right? That you have to have the origin, the source, and somebody he or she shares it with.
Right.
But typically a conspiracy has 2 or more, and the more could be in the thousands or the millions of people. You can look at conspiracies that were actually mass population, spanning conspiracies.
Mm-hmm.
But he once told me, he said, the only way that you can actually keep a conspiracy quiet or keep a secret is if you take that 2 and reduce it down to 1. So his assessment was, if you wanted to keep a secret, you got to kill the other guy. And that does happen, and we can get into that as over the course of this podcast. But I think that one of the other important facets about this whole thing is that you kind of understand who we are and how we came into this. Because a lot of people ask me, well, how did you get into conspiracies?
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to pose the question to Mr. Ron Patton, conspiracy superstar. Ron, how did you get into this?
I knew you were going to ask me that. And actually,
it's a hell of a story.
I know. I mean, some people have heard me talk on other shows, probably already know. But for those who haven't, it actually started when I was 7. I had this epiphany, and I just kind of came to the realization that the world was phony, or the reality that I was in was phony. Because I'd be watching the news, and be talking about the Vietnam War and all these riots all over the place, and I just thought, why can't people just get along? I mean, that makes sense, right?
Sort
if you're nice to people and if you love one another, then good things happen. But when you're mean to people and you kill people and you lie and, have all this deceit, then that just brings people down. So I guess I was just, believe it or not, I was doing a lot of soul searching at the age of 7 because I was pretty sensitive. I was very introspective, and the world just didn't make sense to me. But I guess I came to the realization that there must be like a spiritual variable within the equation of life. Later on, I was able to articulate that. There was something else. And so, personally, I still think there's a spiritual dynamic that's taking place. I don't know exactly what it is per se. I think I have a pretty good idea. But at the same time, that's what made sense to me. And, what it really comes down to is we develop our perspective through our perception, right? Sure. And so our perception is developed how? Through our environment, right? How we're raised, whether we're religious or not, or, so that's really what it came down to. And as the years passed and I got a little bit older, I hooked up with this one ministry that my church was a part of, and it was called Love of God Ministries. And the guy that headed it up was Norman Shear. And this was like back in the 80s. And he always said, Ronnie, get ready, man. After the year 2000, you're just going to go, it's going to be wild. It's going to be crazy.
Well, Ron, the first problem that I hear in this story is he called you Ronnie.
Yeah.
Anybody who calls you Ronnie, dude, watch out.
Well, he was just, yeah, it's kind of weird, but.
Kind of weird? Hey,
well,
Ronnie,
no, actually.
Ronnie, after the year 2000,
no. Okay, so this
down.
was the deal. When I was young, they used to call me Ronnie. When I went to private school, I was called Ronald. And then, once I got out of private school, then I was Ron. But, sometimes, it's sort of just an endearing way to say Ron, right?
I still think it's trouble, man.
I know. So, anyway, Norman was a pretty cool guy. He was like a Messianic Jew, and he had this ministry called Love of God Ministries, and he was exposing the New Age movement and the New World Order and all this stuff, and it just blew me away. And so he would bring in all these speakers, from across the country into Hawaii, and I was just sort of enthralled. I'm just going, man, is this really going to come about? And so, a few years passed. I wasn't really that much into it, but it definitely something that sparked my interest. And then around 1991, 92, I heard this one guy speak at a church who said that he grew up in this satanic family, yet his parents were churchgoers. And I'm going, what? That doesn't make sense, But basically what he was saying is that his dad was in the CIA, and as a cover, they were this good church-going family, but, behind the scenes, they were into, Luciferian rituals, and this guy was under government CIA mind control, and he was talking about monarch programming and how they were creating multiple personality disorder in these children and actually killing some children. And it was just so mind-blowing. I'm going, oh, come on. And actually at that point I was pretty skeptical about a lot of conspiracy type stuff. And I think it was just because it was just so overwhelming. I was very curious, but at the same time, I had nothing to back it up, right? And so then I became a skeptic, and then got to the point of, what's called cognitive dissonance. And I think that's very important when you start examining conspiracies and why people don't want to believe in conspiracies, is because they suffer from cognitive dissonance, which is essentially setting up a denial system, right? When something comes against your beliefs or your ideologies, and there's something deep down inside that says, you know what? This person could be right. But still, you have this built-up wall, so you set up this denial system. And that's what I was doing at the time. But as I started looking into this like CIA mind control stuff that was going on, I realized that it was real. And then I had to ask myself, well, now that I know about it, what am I going to do with it? So I think that was the real, I guess, spark or impetus back in the early 90s that really got me interested in not just researching conspiracies, but it's like, okay, now that I know about these things, how am I going to disseminate it?
You know, it's interesting that it happened to you during the 90s. Like, you really came into it in the 90s, because the 90s were an interesting time. That, you know, you're coming out of the 80s, you know, and in the early 80s, there was this kind of notion of we can all get rich, you know, lifestyles of the rich and famous, you know, champagne wishes and caviar dreams, and, you know, everybody would tune in. And, you know, the American dream wasn't just to have a house or have 2.5 kids, a good job, whatever. It was more like the American dream was to have a Ferrari. You know, everybody wanted to be Don Johnson on Miami Vice, minus the drugs, in some cases with the drugs. But, you know, there was a backlash in the 90s, and, you know, a lot of really kind of interesting stuff came out during that period. You know, that was the whole rise of Illuminate Press and Jim Keith, and, you know, a lot of these people were coming out during that time and talking about the black helicopters. And,
and CTRL, Conspiracy Theory Research List, by Chris Milligan. Yeah.
Well, and research labs, you know, they were looking into taboo stuff and conspiracies, and, you know, the BBS thing was rising. A lot of conspiracy literature was being disseminated over the BBSs, you know, the Anarchist Cookbook, and, you know, a lot of these kinds of early adoption into the modern conspiracy movement. So it's interesting that it's really in that zone that you really kind of came into it.
Yeah, well, and I've met a lot of very interesting people.
Yeah, you have.
Along the way. And, you know, I'm not going to name names right now, but I do have a book that I'm presently writing, and it's called, tentatively titled Swimming with Sharks, Treading the Murky Waters of Conspiracy Research. And, you know, basically it's, you know, talking about wolves in sheep's clothing, people who I thought were on the up and up, and came to the realization that they were kind of like Pied Pipers, right? They were putting out a lot of truth, and they would hide behind like Christianity or whatever to make themselves look really good. But the reality was they would hide behind that and do some pretty awful things to other people. I really don't want to get into it in this show, because you know that like lately it always seems like things pop up where like all of a sudden, oh, you better be careful of this guy Ron Patton. He's a Jesuit spy, or, you know, he's an Illuminati handler or something like that.
Or like an MK Ultra programmer.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
By the way, for those of you who are uninitiated, MK Ultra was a CIA program to brainwash people and do mind control, but we'll get into that in detail in another episode.
Yeah, so it's always interesting when you're accused of something just because you simply, you know, like you get into a debate or an argument with somebody, and if they don't like that, all of a sudden you're like demonized, and they'll spread all kinds of like slanderous stuff. I just have to laugh, and it's like I really want to get into it, but at the same time it's like, Ron, just let it go.
Let it go, man.
Go. And then eventually, you know, people come to the realization that a lot of these people that are saying this kind of garbage are pretty whacked out, right? So. Well,
yeah, I mean, I've been accused of being an Illuminati stooge. I mean, my response to, you know, being accused of being an Illuminati stooge or a government stooge is that, hey, if I was a government stooge or Illuminati stooge, it really doesn't pay well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I wish I had some money.
You know, one of the things that you have to realize is that, you know, when you look at all these conspiracy books out there and you listen to people, you know, Ron and I are human beings, and, you know, we're interested in stuff, and, you know, we listen to people speak and we buy books and go to lectures and stuff. But, I'm always very, very leery of people who have like 100 books and, they're saying things that sound too good to be true. And because, there is a kind of conspiracy industry. There are very few people who do this kind of research. One in particular that has a multimedia empire, and they're making a lot of money at it. And I always have to step back, and no matter who it is, I mean, me included, don't believe me. I'm lying to you. That's what I always tell people. Mm-hmm. But you have to kind of look back and look at the motivations of the people that you're listening to. Why are they saying these things? What's their track record? Fact check it. Because the truth is that when you look at the fact check level of some conspiracy researchers, some conspiracy all-stars, of which Ron and I are not either, you kind of find some interesting things. And it's funny because, you go to these lectures and they speak with authority, and that kind of notion of speaking with authority, mm-hmm. That's one of the ways that you can kind of mind control somebody on a low level, that, without the more sophisticated mind control systems and procedures, because it's very scientific. But on a very low level, if I just walk into a room and I tell you I'm the man and I know this stuff and I'm the boss and I'm assertive and aggressive, you have a tendency to believe me. There was once a study, I think it was done at Stanford, where they brought in these people and they sat them down in front of a console, and every time the person answered wrong, there's a person in another room and they could hear him. Every time they answered wrong, they were supposed to shock them. Right?
Right.
And the guy who was giving them the instructions, he was wearing a lab coat. Nobody was ever told that the guy was a doctor or that the guy was an expert. He just simply had a lab coat on. Mm-hmm. And so, time after time on these studies, that they people would keep buzzing them. And each time they would buzz them to electrify the person in the other room. There was no person in another room. But every time they do it, the voltage would increase. And they were very aware of what the voltage was. And there was if I remember correctly, there was a marker where it said like lethal. And they would keep hitting the button. And they would reach a point where the dosage of electricity was supposedly lethal.
Right.
But they would keep hitting the button because some guy in a lab coat said, "Oh, don't worry about it." And the guy with the lab coat would come in and say, "Oh, they're answering wrong. Screw them. Go ahead and electrocute them." There's a person be like, "Yeah, but it's lethal. I'm going to kill him." And the person in the lab coat would be like, "Don't worry about them. They'll be fine." Right. And they keep doing it. So there's this kind of authority complex that 99% of the population has. And
well, that's why people are controlled much easier under a rigid hierarchical structure.
That's true.
So especially within religion, right? You see that.
Oh yeah.
All over the place, and of course in politics too. And sometimes I think so many people are used to just given two choices, right? And again, since we're getting into this conspiracy stuff, you can look at Hegelian dialectics where people are kind of given a couple of choices, right? And little do we realize that none of those choices may be valid. But whether it's like Democrat, Republican, capitalism, communism, anything that, has to do with conflicting views or diametrical views, it's like, okay, it has to be either this or that.
Yeah, it's always binary. It's on or off, 0 or 1. Right.
So that's very linear thinking, and a lot of that linear thinking, I think, is instilled through our education system, our religious system, and just the way we're raised. It's almost multi-generational. It's almost inbred in our DNA.
Well, it goes back to time immemorial. But a lot of times people go, "Oh, you're crazy." I'd say, you can see this stuff actually acted out in real life. Mm-hmm. And people come back and they say, "Oh, you're nuts. Where's the tinfoil hat?" And I say, "Well, I don't wear a tinfoil hat. I wear a helmet, but these things are there, and you can see it with Ben Carson. You know, he was a classic example of the Hegelian dialectic, where, you know, he came out and some of the population liked him and liked what he was saying, and then he was exposed that he had lied about his interactions and, you know, with the whole going to West Point thing.
Right.
And then there's a whole process that they, the powers that be, the quote unquote they, went through in the media to dismantle the guy. Mm-hmm. And basically nobody said anything. Everybody knew that he was lying.
Right.
And nobody said anything because he hadn't, it either wasn't I think in this case it wasn't the right time. Mm-hmm. Right? Or, you know, it didn't hurt anybody yet, so nobody said anything. And finally he got to a point where he was getting some traction. After a couple of the debates, he was starting to get some traction. And then magically it comes out that he was lying. And
right.
I mean, he wasn't just lying, he was lying big.
Right.
I mean, it was big lies.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole system called the Hegelian dialectic that they use to dismantle him and to basically terminate his bid for the presidency. And in doing that, right, they funneled all of his supporters into another candidate and boosted that candidate up, because he said, well, I'm going down, but I'm telling everybody who agrees with me, go vote for that guy, and then suddenly that guy's numbers increase. And then wouldn't you know it, he's disgraced, so to speak, and then he gets a good job at a PAC. So
right.
That's how these things work, right?
Right.
He was basically sacrificed to boost up another candidate, and then they gave him a very nice job at a political action committee.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of conspiracies, hey,
yes.
Have you ever noticed that, you know, there used to be a lot of soap operas on TV?
Sure.
But there's not a lot of soap operas on anymore. You know why?
No.
Because I think political debates are the soap operas. Seriously. I mean, when you think about it, it's just like, and everybody is so interested in watching them. And I've watched them a few times, but it's like, oh man, you just like want to throw up. It's like, why are people so enthralled in this dog and pony show?
Well, I think it's because they, you know, they're vicariously living through that moment, that they, you know, as Americans, we want the big tough guy. I mean, we want to vote for the big tough guy.
Yeah.
Whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, it's really irrelevant. But, you know, we want to vote for the big tough guy. And so what's happened over time is that the political discourse in this country has degraded. Mm-hmm. And so where it used to be that, you know, they could disagree, but they would find common ground and just make stuff happen. Mm-hmm. Now they're like, I disagree with you, so I just will not talk to you. And you see these comments. I mean, you know, the comments about Donald Trump's penis. I mean,
right.
I'm 40 years old. I saw Ronald Reagan debate. You know, I've seen them all. Right. Everything from Jimmy Carter on. I've seen that debate.
Right.
I swear to God, I've never seen anybody in a debate talk about the size of somebody else's penis. That just was mind-boggling to me.
I know. You just got to crack up and you're going, okay, moving along.
And the other thing that I found is that it used to be a long time ago that when a candidate, you know, candidates, they always lie. They always pander. Left, right, center, doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. They're pandering for votes. They recognize that you're never going to be 100% aligned with them. Mm-hmm. So they're looking for you to be mostly aligned with them.
Right.
Right. They want to get that kind of 75% threshold where it's like, well, they're not perfect, but they're good enough. I'll vote for you.
Right.
You know, it just.
I don't even think it's we really have that much of a say when it comes to the presidential elections. Anyway, I think it's all rigged to begin with. So it's just.
Well, we saw that with Gore. I mean that was. I think I was in college when that happened, mm-hmm. and that's when I really knew. You know, for me, my odyssey into this world of pain started when I was about 7 as well.
Wow.
Yeah. And I saw a bizarre object in front of my second-story window. Mm-hmm. It was a bluish-white light that just kind of hovered there.
Mm-hmm.
And I really didn't understand what it was, or I was scared out of my mind. And I was reading a Choose Your Own Adventure, and I hid under the blanket, and I came back up, and it was still there.
Mm-hmm.
And I closed my eyes and opened them; it was still there. And so I finally worked up the nerve to run across the hall to go get my dad, because I'm 7. I thought my dad was invincible. He was the toughest guy in the world and the smartest guy in the world, and he still is.
Mm-hmm.
And he might listen to this. and I said, Dad, you were in the military. He had gone to Vietnam. I said, you were in the military. You know what airplanes look like. My family, has had people who were in the Air Force.
Right.
You know what an airplane looks like, right? He goes, sure, of course I do. So, okay, come in and tell me what this thing is. So my dad had a military issue baton, like a baton for a policeman.
Yeah.
So he pulls that thing out and he's ready to go. Walks into my room and it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, Dad, it was really there. I'm not lying to you. And he goes, and my father, I give him a lot of credit. He goes, you know what? I totally believe you. Mm-hmm. And he made a comment to me that I'll never forget. He said, there's some weird stuff out there. And so I needed to understand what I had seen.
Mm-hmm.
And the next day, lucky for me, was library day at my elementary school. And so back when elementary schools had libraries and library days and librarians. And I went and I explained to the librarian, I said, hey, I saw this weird thing. I want to check out a book and figure out what it was. And to her credit, with total conventional thinking, she points me to the Dewey Decimal card thing and says, look up aircraft or airplanes. And I said, no, this wasn't an airplane. This was something else. And she goes, oh. And I said, oh, what? She goes, oh. What you're looking for is I still remember where it was. It's in the other room in the left-hand corner at the bottom, and she gave me exactly where it was located. And I can still go there today if I went to the school.
Right.
And there were 3 books. There was J. Allen Hynek, Messengers of Deception, or Jacques Vallée, Messengers of Deception, J. Allen Hynek's book on the UFOs, and Brad Steiger, Mysteries of Time and Space. And so I checked all 3 out, and I'm like, I'm going to get to the bottom of this shit. I'm going to find out what this thing was. And so I check them out, and she goes, oh, you're checking those out. And I said, well, I want the answer. I'm a snotty 7-year-old. I'm like, I'm going to find out what's going on.
Right.
And so I checked them out. I took them home. I could not really get into Vallée or Hynek. It was just too dense for me.
Yeah.
But I read Brad Steiger's book cover to cover.
Mm-hmm.
And it really mind-warped me, because the Steiger's book was not just about UFOs. It was about cryptids and time vortexes and, space vortexes and ghosts and all kinds of ESP and all this crazy stuff. So at that point, I was like, oh, now I understand why she said, oh, there's a lot more to this.
Mm-hmm.
So I spent a long time trying to understand the UFO thing. I had pretty much excluded the cryptids, cryptozoology, Bigfoot and the Jersey Devil and all that. I kind of just, in my juvenile mind, just discounted that. I said, you know what? I'm going to figure this UFO thing out. At 7, I have the brain power to do it. I'm going to solve this problem. J. Allen Hynek couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Jacques Vallée couldn't do it. But damn it, I can. And so I read and read and read, and I made my mom take me to the bookstore, and I bought books, and fairly sophisticated books, and I'm building up and year after year, and I'm building up. And in reading those books, I became a kind of true believer, right? And I at that point, every funky light in the sky was like, that's an alien, right? And I did see some things that you would classify as a UFO. I saw hanging at about 20,000 feet over my parents' house the Lazar Sportster model. I saw this thing. Mm-hmm. Just Google Lazar Sportster model. I saw that thing hanging at about 20,000 feet over my house.
Right.
Clear as a bell. Middle of the day, I took.
Now, where was this again?
This was in the Bay Area.
Wow.
And I was out walking the dog, And, I had no idea who Bob Lazar was. This is before Bob Lazar ever came out. Bob Lazar came out and told a story about how he worked at this place called S4, back engineering UFOs. Well, he did that in 89, right? This was way before then. This was like 85, 86 when this happened. And, I'm like, oh, it's a UFO. And at that point, I was like, oh, it's a UFO. It's aliens. No big deal. Right. So I finished walking the dog and go back inside. But, year after year, I read more and more and more and more and more and more. And I got to the point where I was a true believer.
Right.
And it wasn't really until I met my girlfriend when I was in junior college that she has a very skeptical mind.
Right.
And so she was like, why do you think everything's a UFO? I said, well, look, here, let me show you the book, And she started to push back on me and say, well, prove they're aliens. And I said, well, I can't. I can't prove a negative. I mean, I can't prove to you they're aliens. They're not like landing on my lawn. And she says, you've got to kind of look at this from a different point of view. Instead of just assuming that they're aliens, you got to look at it and try to figure out what it really is. And, I'm 19 years old. I was kind of befuddled by this. And, well, okay, I guess they're not aliens, right? And so, I had always been an avid reader of aerospace stuff. And I was reading, Jane's Defense Weekly, and I was reading Air and Space Technology Week and these other things. And I started to see these aircraft in these magazines that looked like what I saw. Not the circle of light. I've never figured out what that was, but I started to see these objects, that I had seen at night. And I started to see them, and I started to see these wedge-shaped things and these saucer-shaped things, and I started to realize, well, maybe they're not alien. Right? And over time, the more and more I saw, the more and more I realized that they're probably not alien. And I think that's where it began. That once I realized and I could rationalize that these were not alien objects, then I needed to understand what they were. And once I needed to understand, because I need to rationalize, right?
Right.
Once I convinced myself that they were not alien, then I had to go through a discovery process of what could they possibly be. And that kind of led to more conspiracies, because conspiracies really are like a pit. It's like a hole.
Yeah.
And it's actually, I've always explained to people, it's more like a black hole. That there are parts of a black hole, and there's this thing called a Schwarzschild radius, where you start to feel the gravitational effects of the black hole. It's kind of like that I had crossed that threshold, and I was feeling more and more sucked into this idea that there are conspiracies. And, as I read more, I was sucked more toward the event horizon. And once you get to the event horizon, you can't escape, because the escape velocity is the speed of light. So you plunge down the black hole and you're ripped apart. Well, as I approached the event horizon, I suddenly realized, oh, wait a minute, these aren't aliens. And that allowed me to back off.
Right.
But, once you start to try to figure out what they really are, then you're exposed to a ginormous number of different conspiracies, right? Because the way that these projects are kept secret are highly sophisticated.
Well, yeah, and not only that, they're just very compartmentalized as well.
That's what I meant.
And
it's all intermixed. The people who are involved in all these experimental aircraft, you see these names over and over and over again, and they're all interlinked. And then you look up who these guys are, and then you find out things like the Council on Foreign Relations, because that VP at Lockheed is a member of the CFR. Then you go look at what the CFR is, and then that's another rabbit hole. And then you start to realize that all these things fit together.
Right. And so there's I think a lot of times there are people that are sort of unwittingly a part of a large conspiracy without really knowing it. because they're involved maybe with a small section of something that's going on, and
Absolutely.
then somebody else is doing something, but it all fits together in a very systematic, synchronistic way. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. I've always contended that 99.9% of the people involved in any given conspiracy have no idea that they're a member of it. And it's kind of analogous to, you could have a guy who's a machinist, and he comes to work, and he's working for a little machine shop, and they give him a piece of metal and drill a hole in that. He goes, okay, and he drills a hole in it, and he gives it to his boss. And it turns out that machine shop had a little tiny contract with another outfit. They took his, kind of sheet with a hole in it. They gave it to another guy, drilled 2 more holes. Okay, 2 more holes. And eventually it ends up in a triangular-shaped drone, right? Mm-hmm. And none of these guys have any idea what they're working on. It's only the guys at the very end that have to put all the components together. And they compartmentalize it because, as I said in the beginning, it's very hard to keep a secret. You can't really functionally keep a secret with more than one person.
Mm-hmm.
So, inevitably the secret will come out however it happens. So, they compartmentalize it to limit their liability.
And then they spoon feed the public too, where they'll reveal a certain amount of a conspiracy that's, they figure, well, it's open for public consumption and it's not going to really affect our bottom line, so we'll just kind of let a little bit out, and then we'll also throw in a little bit of disinformation. But they'll articulate it in such a way that it sounds very viable, and that's why I think people are so easily deceived, whoever it is, whether people believe in conspiracies or not. I think it's just human nature, like you were saying earlier. Mm-hmm. If it's a lot easier to believe somebody who sounds very intelligent, and that sort of coupled with utilizing neurolinguistic programming, NLP, you can make people believe in all kinds of things.
Well, one of the classic examples of that is a program called the A12.
Mm-hmm.
The A12 was built by Lockheed Skunk Works. It was actually the predecessor to the SR-71, and they built it out at Groom Lake. And it was I think a little longer than an SR-71, and it was silver. And so this thing would take off and fly around, and people would see it, and they wouldn't really. It doesn't look like an airplane that they would have seen back in the 70s, and so they were kind of confused as to what they were looking at. So what do? It's a UFO. It's aliens. Well, the CIA, who was sponsoring the program with Lockheed, went back and said, you know what? Sure, it's aliens. And so they put in people into these UFO groups to say, hey, that's not a secret spy plane, that's an alien ship. And so they misidentified a lot of the A-12s as UFOs. And interestingly enough, at the same time, the KGB was actually inserting people into these groups because the groups were going skywatching, and they wanted to have the KGB agent go along with the skywatch to see if they could ferret out new and experimental aircraft, because the Russians at that time, the Soviets, they didn't believe that they were UFOs. They thought they were experimental planes.
Right.
So they would send in KGB operatives, and so in one room you've got CIA guys telling, oh yeah, it's a UFO, and you've got KGB guys going, yeah, it's a UFO, so it was a very interesting dynamic. Mm-hmm. But another classic example of how this all works is that there was a guy, it's a long story, so it's probably better suited for its own episode, but in brief, there was a guy, his name was Bob Ashlar, and he was recruited into a program called Cosmic Journey. And it was supposed to be a traveling, this is the whole disclosure thing. And he was supposed to participate in this program. He had worked at NASA. He was a mission specialist. And they thought his knowledge of that and his interest in UFOs, that he would be a good guy to kind of consult on it. And he was having conversations with this guy named Bobby Ray Inman, who was a former head of the CIA. He was an admiral in the Navy, had been, and retired into the CIA.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right, and so Ashlar kind of thought to himself, wait a minute, this is getting kind of funky, these things that we're talking about. So he started recording the phone calls, and he's got these recordings of him and Inman talking about this road show to expose Roswell, and they have these 18-wheeler trucks that with frozen alien bodies and tanks and wreckage, and the famous I-beam with the hieroglyphics and all this stuff. And eventually Ashlar decided to go public, and I think he went public on Sightings, of all the shows to do it on. I love that show. But he went public on there. He played the tapes of Inman, nailed. It was a slam dunk. He's got Inman on the tape saying, "Yeah, UFOs are real." And so somebody in the hierarchy decided that it was time to discredit him. So somebody sent him a manila envelope from Canada with the name Guardian on it, and it was inside there was a VHS tape. Tells you when this happened. And he played it, and it looked like a bunch of RCMP Mounties surrounding this thing that looked like a UFO that was landing. So, of course, Ashlar goes and says, "Hey, I got something new to show you guys," and kind of breaks that one wide open. And then there's just like a torrent, just a torrent assaulting the man from every angle, just completely discrediting the poor guy. And and it turns out that it was a helicopter, and they had the flight logs, and the RCMP produced all the documentation that it was a RCMP thing, and this helicopter had landed in a field, and Ashlar vanished. So this kind of neurolinguistic programming, once Ashlar had kind of exposed the cosmic journey thing, then the machine set about to take him apart, and they used the kind of authoritative words and authoritative language to just rip this guy apart. So you see it all the time, and the one thing that I should point out is that in disinformation, which is spread constantly, there are entire TV networks that are pretty much devoted to it at this point. There's a thing called the golden thread, and so the golden thread is absolutely true. So if you look at the very core of the disinformation, it is absolutely true. That's the golden thread. That's the thing where you grasp onto it, you can rationalize it and say, oh, this thing is real. I believe this. And then the details that they wrap around it are utter BS. But the golden thread itself is very, very true. So what you do is in disinformation, the game that you play is trying to use a scalpel and to cut away the layers of disinformation, and the way you do that is that you look at the details, and you seek out the details to see if it's true. And if it's not true, you discard it. And eventually, when you, like peeling an onion, when you get to the very center, then that is the golden thread. That little bit of information is true. The problem is that sometimes these onions are massive.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Well, and then another aspect of conspiracy research that I learned from looking at some of Mae Brussels' old writings and her old radio shows. Mae Brussel, by the way, is considered the queen of conspiracy research. She was a wealthy Jewish housewife in the early 60s, and JFK was assassinated, and after that her whole life changed, and she devoted her whole life into understanding the Jfk assassination and who was involved. And man, it got down to the Nazis and to all these Bob, the CIA, and so she utilized some very interesting concepts to utilize cross patterning through different sources and basically getting to the money trail. Once you establish a money trail, then you could basically see who is pulling the strings. So I know we only have a few minutes left, Olaf, but I just wanted to maybe touch upon a CIA document that talks about conspiracy theories and sort of how it was maybe the conspiracy theory phrase was formulated to discredit people who believe in conspiracies.
You go, Ron Patton.
Well, thank you very much. Hey, it was called CIA Document 1035-960. It was actually released in 1976 through the Freedom of Information Act. And the New York Times basically put it out. And this was a directive which was especially significant because it outlines the CIA's concerns regarding the whole reputation of the American government, especially dealing with the Warren Commission report on the Jfk assassination. And so the agency was very much interested in maintaining, its own image and its role as it contributed information to the Warren investigation. So basically, the memorandum lays out a detailed series of actions and techniques for countering and discrediting the claims of the conspiracy theorists so as to inhibit the circulation of such claims in other countries. And it says, for example, approaching friendly elite contacts, especially politicians and editors, to remind them of the Warren Commission's integrity and soundness should be prioritized. The charges of the critics are without serious foundation, the document reads, and further speculative discussion only plays into the hands of the communist opposition. There we go, the dialectic, right?
Absolutely.
The agency also directed its members to employ propaganda assets to negate and refute the attacks of the critics. Book reviews and feature articles are particularly appropriate for this purpose. So the CIA document 1035-960 further delineates specific techniques for countering conspiratorial arguments centering on the Warren Commission's findings. Such responses and their coupling with the pejorative label have been routinely wheeled out in various guises by corporate media outlets, commentators, political leaders to this day against those demanding truth and accountability about momentous public events. So those momentous public events could be, anything from the Oklahoma City bombing to 9/11 to Sandy Hook, and a lot of these very traumatic events. And, we'll get into those another time and how they really created this mass trauma that has affected the American psyche for over 60 years now.
I wanted to put in something as well. I've been at this for a long time, and I do firmly believe that you were mentioning Mae Brussel and the JFK assassination. I think that there were two climactic events that really kind of drove modern conspiracy theory as we understand it today.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first was really the assassination of JFK.
Right.
In the United States and the Western world, when Kennedy was assassinated, I think once everybody got past the notion that Kennedy had been assassinated, that I think a lot of people really started to wonder, especially given, their general distrust or dislike of LBJ. I think a lot of people believed that there was a conspiracy to kill him, that it wasn't, his assassination was a fundamental conspiracy, and that it wasn't the lone crackpot gunman. And I think that especially given that a lot, that we had the Vietnam War going on at the time, I think that kind of catalyzed in the American public this, and the Western world, this notion that conspiracies happen and conspiracies are real. Because if you walk down the street and ask anybody who's over 40 about JFK, they're going to go, well, the CIA did it, or Castro did it, or the mob did it. It's never Lee Harvey Oswald.
Right.
And in the Soviet Union, I think that the Warsaw Pact, I think that they had a similar kind of event. That when Yuri Gagarin died, he was flying a plane and it crashed. When Yuri Gagarin died, I think a lot of Soviets were like, oh, that, the Soviets, I think, were much more primed to the conspiracies because they lived in an oppressive totalitarian regime. Mm-hmm. But I think that it really catalyzed for them when Gagarin died. Because, I talked to two guys, both of them were were Russians, and they lived during that time. And the one guy, he said, oh, well, Gagarin died because he was a drunk and he crashed his plane.
Mm-hmm.
And the other guy said, who was also there, and they were friends,
Right.
said, no, the KGB killed him. And so, the death of Gagarin and the death of JFK, I think both were catalyzing factors in pushing forward the notion of conspiracy theory. Now, if you go to somebody who's under 40 or 50 and talk about Gagarin or these things, then, it's not
relevant.
It's not relevant to them, but to the older generation who were our teachers and who were our politicians and who were, those people that we looked up to, Grandma and Grandpa, telling you stories by the campfire, sitting out on the porch with a lemonade, right?
Yeah.
They believed it. And so that changed their worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And that change in their worldview opened up conspiracies to the masses. And then after the events of the 80s and the 90s, I mean, there were a lot of conspiracy stuff that happened in the 80s, even more in the 90s. When you get done with the black helicopters over America and mass mind control and some of these other things, there were a lot of things that were emerging during that time about the syphilis experiments and a lot of these covert experiments that were taking place upon the U.S. public.
Mm-hmm.
Then suddenly you have things like the X-Files that come along.
Right.
And there was a predecessor to the X-Files called Kolchak the Night Stalker. It was more about crypto.
I remember that. Yeah.
It was more about crypto stuff, cryptozoology
but
stuff.
the 90s were just inundated with conspiracy shows like
everywhere.
I mean, I actually,
Skies.
honestly, I like Dark Skies better than I did the X-Files.
Same here.
Because it had some historical context to it. And then there was a show called The Pretender.
Right.
Which I could really relate to because I knew a lot of MK Ultra survivors who talked about being at a special type of school, like a gifted kids school when they were younger. And so that's what that reminded me of. And then there was Nowhere Man. So it was just a very interesting time back in the 90s. And I think part of it was spun from all those events like Waco and Oklahoma City bombing and Ruby Ridge.
The rise of the militia movement.
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
So I think, you've got people that were coming into power in the 90s, and these people they had experienced the Kennedy assassination. They had experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis. They had experienced all these events, mutually assured destruction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Vietnam. I think it was in the 90s that they exposed the Tonkin Gulf incident, the thing that supposedly started Vietnam. They exposed that as a fraud. They actually talked about the Liberty and a whole lot of other things, USS Liberty. And so, in the 90s, these people came into power, and suddenly these people were in control of television. And suddenly, we'd start to see this conspiracy programming. There's sightings. Sightings was on. Art Bell was huge.
Right.
I remember in the late 90s, driving home. I lived in Davis at the time. I was going to Davis. And, this is the Hale Bop thing. And I remember vividly driving on this lonely freeway before there were lights on the freeway. And listening to Art Bell, broadcasting from the Kingdom of Nye and talking about Hale Bop. And I'm looking up and Hale Bop is in the sky. And, it was a whole era. Listening to Ground Zero. I mean, it was a whole era that happened in the mid to late 90s that, that just kind of exploded on the scene. I mean, even Paranoia, our favorite magazine, it was founded in the early 90s. So
that's very true. Back in 1992. Blowing mine since 1992, brother.
We have another T-shirt coming, by the way, bitch slapping the sheeple since 92.
Oh, that'll be nice. I'm going to give one to my woman.
Well, anyway, so that's all I got.
Well, I think it's been a great show so far. So what do we have in store for some upcoming shows?
Well, for me, I want to talk about the Secret Space Program, my favorite topic. Project Lunix, Project Horizon, moon bases. I want to talk about Project Azorian, another of my favorites. It's got everything in it. Howard Hughes, Russian submarines, all kinds of nutty stuff. But, one of the other things that we want to do is that, if there's a subject that's near and dear to your heart, let us know. We're going to try as hard as we can to make these about once a week on Sundays. And we'll get them out maybe a day or two after that. But, just send us a message on Twitter. It's Paranoia Mag on Twitter. Or you can catch us on Facebook at Paranoia Magazine on Facebook. Or you can find us at paranoiamagazine.com, paranoiapublishing.com. Send us what you want to know about. Maybe you heard a term that somebody threw out there during a Ground Zero episode, or the Higher Side Chats, or any of the other Grammarica, some of our favorites, the Kev Baker Show. Maybe you heard something on one of those that you're interested in and they didn't really kind of get into it. Send us a message. We'll discuss it, and in some cases debate it, because, I want to stress that Ron and I don't always agree. But, if there are two sides, we'll definitely give you two sides worth.
Yeah, but you usually submit after a while because because the struggle's just too much for you at times. And you just realize it.
It's the neurolinguistic.
I'm the alpha dog here.
Yeah, no. Right. See, I heard even more laughing. There you go.
Yeah. The fan club here.
Hey, so Ron, what kinds of stuff do you want to do?
I think, what I'm interested in is mind control is sort of my area of research that I've been involved with for a number of years. But sort of the current aspect, or the current part of mind control, sort of like MK Ultra 2.0, sort of entailing electronic harassment and even the utilization of biotelemetric type of devices, and even getting into transhumanism now. So I don't even know if it's appropriate to say mind control, because it's more like
system control.
System mind control, or system control, or basically their desire to control not only our minds but our bodies and our soul, if you will. So I think that's something that I'd really like to explore further in some upcoming episodes of Paranoia.
Yes. All right. So there you go. That's the first one. Hopefully, you enjoyed it, and I had a lot of fun making it. Ron, I hope you did too. Oh yeah.
It was a blast, brother.
It was a blast.
But and then also we have an upcoming issue of Paranoia, the Conspiracy Reader, coming out soon, right?
Coming out very soon, probably in the next couple weeks. We got some really awesome stuff. Jay Dyer did a amazing article on analyzing Eyes Wide Shut.
Mm-hmm.
Tim Schwartz is going to be writing an article. I think you got a couple people writing articles.
Yeah, Gon Shimura has a really excellent article coming out, which I think a lot of people will just be blown away by. Yeah, he's a young up-and-coming podcaster and researcher. And then a good friend of mine, Kevin Patton, who we both met at Occupy Bohemian Grove,
yes,
has a very extensive article called Bohemian Battles.
Yep.
And we'll also have a report on the electronic harassment symposium that occurred in Europe, and that'll also be in the upcoming issue. And we'll also have something out from our good friend Frater X.
That's right. That's coming too.
Called The Ghost of the Nephilim. And of course, our good friend Clyde Lewis from Ground Zero will also have an article. We'll still have to kind of figure out which one to procure. But yeah, it's just going to be,
a potpourri.
Sort of like old.
It's a potpourri of weirdness.
Yeah. But I think, and that's how Paranoia originally came out, back in the early 90s. It was just sort of like all different angles. And, the thing I appreciated when I was writing for Paranoia back in the 90s is that they would take contrasting articles or people with different opinions. They write about the same subject. Like, for instance, I wrote an article called Demons and Aliens Clothing back in 96 that had to do more with the spiritual implications of the UFO alien phenomena. And then in the same issue, there was a guy by the name of William Lyne, Lyne, who is author of a book called Space Aliens from the Pentagon. And the title of his article was called No Aliens, Just Assholes.
That's a pretty awesome article, by the way.
Yeah, but basically he came from an atheist point of view. So he came at it from different angles, but you know what? People loved it because it was like, oh, wow, you guys are talking about the same thing, but from a different perspective. And so I think that's what really sets Paranoia magazine apart from other types of publications, is we're not afraid to kind of venture out and have differences of opinion.
And you know, we're willing to give people a voice. You know, we've published articles about the flat earth and about everything in between. You know, we think that all people have a right to get their point across. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we try to put it out there and let the reader decide.
Yep. It's a good ride, brother.
That's right. All right. Well, I'm going to call it quits on this one.
All righty.
So, in the immortal words of George Carlin, be excellent to one another. And we'll wrap this one up and see you next week.
Take good care and keep the faith, brother.
Thank you for listening to Paranoia Radio, hosted by Olaf Phillips and Ron Patton. Sponsored by Paranoia Magazine. Read it now. ParanoiaMagazine.com. Intro theme, The Guide, was composed by Scott Moon. ScottMoon.net. Outro theme, Fighting Trousers, is by Professor Elemental. ProfessorElemental.com. Voiceover written and performed by Mr. Lovo, host of Cinema Insomnia. Watch new episodes on OSI 74. Visit us at OSI74.com. We are resuming control. For now.